and like that you took the time to actually reflect on, is it what you want? And I know a lot of entrepreneurs go through it, you know.
Yeah.
They have a business, they built the business, and they're overwhelmed by the business, but they just don't want to leave because either the feeling of obligation or you know, just the fear of losing the business. Like, what are you going to do now? And you know, you're known as something, moving on to something else is like really scary. Hello. Thank you everyone for joining us today. On today's episode, we have Serena Holmes with us. She's going to be sharing all her insights on investing, business growth, everything that makes her her. And I'd like to welcome you here today. And I'd like to start out by having you share a little bit about who you are, what you've done, and you know how you ended up from where you were to where you are now.
Yeah, of course. So I ended up kind of in my own business quite by accident. I know that you and I had a chat beforehand, but essentially I was working part-time while I was in university in events, and I never intended to, go into that field, but I had an opportunity to basically come on board with the company in its infancy and started out part-time. It led into full-time management, and then I offered partnership shortly after. And surprise, surprise, the founder of the business actually ended up leaving only really about 4 years into the company being started. So I was presented with the opportunity where I could buy her out. We could partner with another agency, or we could just split what was in the bank and walk away. So I ended up taking the opportunity to buy her out. It was back in 2008 during the recession. So I went through that process. It took about 2 years for the buyout to be completed. And I ended up running that agency for another 14 years on my own. And I sold it just over 2 years ago now.
Awesome. And that journey for you, I mean, it ended up being an award-winning agency. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we were primarily focused on experiential marketing and event staffing. Event staffing was definitely a little bit more higher volume and a bigger side of the business. But, we'd been probably in business about 8 years. And I just thought, I've been winging it this whole time. Like, I'm sure there's a lot of things that I don't know. So I ended up hiring my first business coach, and that led into a mentorship program. And over the span of many years, had different coaches so that we could continue to build the business and learn about leadership and sales, strategy, SEO, and all of those different things. And then just started kind of putting ourselves out there for some of the different awards that are in existence. So we ended up taking home about 18 in total. So I kind of joke that it's one for every year I was running the business. So the 4 years before and then the 14 years afterwards. But we definitely got a lot of recognition for our work, and we work with clients all across Canada, some clients that were in the States, even as far as Greece, the government of South Australia. So it was pretty wide reaching in terms of the businesses that we worked with.
And how do you think that having those awards helped to boost the business? Like, did it bring in new customers?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's a very competitive, highly concentrated business. Not maybe as much when we started, but as time passed, there's not really much of a barrier for entry when people want to come in. It's not like the events industry is heavily regulated or anything like that. So as long as you've got the internet and access to a computer and other social media, I'm not going to say easy, but you can definitely kind of get started. So I think we were always looking at ways that we could differentiate ourselves. So when we provided quotes, we didn't just give a quote in an email. We had a very nicely designed template, and it would talk about our business. It would talk about the awards that we'd won. And, we just always want to have that distinction from other people that might just write back and say it's $25 an hour. We were very, very detailed in how we presented all the information based on what a client would want. And a number of reasons for that. We want to set ourselves apart, but we also want to make sure that we are, understanding of what we need from each other in terms of what the expectations are and what we're going to be delivering for an event.
Okay. And how do you think entrepreneurs in the space should utilize that? Do you think that it works for every industry or just specifically that industry?
Yeah, I mean, every business I think is different, but I think at its core, it really comes down to the kind of business systems that you have. So I think having things templated makes it a lot easier for you. In the very beginning, it's not like we were overly busy, but then when we started doing search engine optimization in 2012, we started with maybe 100 quotes that year, and every year we grew by 100 more quotes. So by, I think, 2019, we had done 750 quotes. So you
Wow.
can imagine just even the volume of quoting on business and proposals and stuff like that would be a lot more tenuous if you didn't have those kinds of templates. So
Mhm.
you would just kind of plug in all of that information and be able to kind of whip things off fairly quickly. And obviously there could be proposals that would be more time consuming and things like that. But for the most part, like having those things templated, even event protocols, feedback forms, reports, even all of the like systems and operating and handbooks and stuff like that, just so that when you are hiring new employees, it's a lot easier to onboard them because they have a visual representation of everything that you want them to do, and not only what they're doing, but like how they're actually doing it. And part of it was onboarding. The other part is for consistency. So if, for example, someone's offsite at an event or they have to call in sick, anyone can jump into their file at any one point in time and kind of be able to pick up where they're at for that day and just continue along.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I know in our business, we use a lot of systems, right? And it's really important. How did you get into that model? Was it mentorship? Did someone come in and say, hey, listen, this is the best way
Yeah.
to grow it? Or
Yeah. Going back to my point on coaching and mentorship, there was one particular program that was called the Executive Council, and it was essentially a group of business owners that met every month for 8 hours. So I think we had a group of 10 or 12 of us. And every month there would be a different topic. Sometimes there would be expert speakers brought in and things like that. But we would learn about things like sales and systems and leadership and HR and like all these different things. And we also learned about, one thing was like a green box exercise, for example. So when you run a business, it's not like it's just you. Like there's a lot of people that depend on you. So if you get in an accident or you died unexpectedly, like what happens, like how does someone pick up the pieces? So just having that kind of information readily available so that in the very unforeseen situation, something like that were to happen, and just really trying to understand and learn from each other on how to scale and grow.
mm-hmm.
And then we also provided support to each other where we go through things called OCIs, which was opportunities, challenges. OCI. I'm like, what's the other thing? I was like, opportunities, challenges, and issues. But essentially, you kind of go through it and outline what you're facing, and everybody would give you feedback on how to tackle that because, again, they all have different levels of experience, and you may not know what you don't know, and just having that different lens and that different perspective on things can be really beneficial, especially when, for me, I was the only person running the business after my partner left, so it's not like I could just talk about an employee I was having issues with my other employees, so it's important to have that support. And yes, I could talk to my husband about it, but it's still not quite the same as talking to other business owners about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how is that now that you're in a different industry? Can we touch in that now and see, what the transition was like selling the company and moving into what you're doing now?
Yeah, for sure. So going back to that first coach that I had, two of the biggest takeaways that I had from her was managing kind of a dashboard to understand like where leads are coming in, how to manage your margins and stuff like that. And then the other side of it was investing. So she said, the average business only operates on about 3 months of cash flow. And at that point in time, I think I had like a year and a half. And I was like, I always just try to be very cautious with the money because sometimes you get big opportunities. And if a client was late paying a balance or a deposit, like you always want to know that you can pay people on time. Mm-hmm. So we were very committed to paying staff biweekly, in the beginning by check, eventually that led into direct deposit. So you always had to make sure you had that cushion. And she said, if you aren't comfortable with taking that much out, like maybe even take out half of it. So I basically took that and ended up buying a short-term rental in Florida, which I kept for 4 years and sold that, did well. And then continued to learn just from other real estate investors and joining different groups. So I ended up buying a couple more properties, investing in land development and syndicated mortgages and things like that. And a big part of that was that I wanted to be able to take a step back from my business and start a family. And I wanted to be able to decrease the dependency I had to take my income from the company. So I thought, well, if I'm doing some of these investments and making some passive income, then I can maybe cut my pay in half. So I did that the year before I went on maternity leave. And then we went into COVID 3 months after my daughter was born. So a lot of our work dried up because we were in events. So we couldn't really pivot into other things. So I was actually able to kind of ramp up some of those investments and, live off of that while my company wasn't necessarily bringing in any business during that period of time. So ironically, I listed the company to sell, I think it was 2 to 3 weeks before we went into lockdown. And it was just because the girl that I had promoted and trained to be my mat leave replacement that I'd had for 6 years resigned when my daughter was just a couple months old. So at that time, I just, I didn't really know how I was going to run a business of that volume without having someone there as like my right hand, because we had 10 of us full time. There was about 2,200 part time. And I hired a mergers and acquisitions company. They valued the company. And then we went into lockdown. So it's kind of hard to sell an events company when you can't even run events. So, I just basically kept it going for a couple of years. And then the one employee that I kept throughout that period of time resigned in January of 2022. And I just felt like to scale back up as quickly as I would need to coming out of COVID, I wanted to be able to have like kind of one person supporting me, because I just couldn't see myself scaling back as quickly as needed on my own, especially with like a 2-year-old running around and stuff like that. So I got a mutual release from the mergers and acquisitions company. And I basically just reached out to a bunch of agencies in Toronto that I thought would see value in our search engine optimization and our website. And I basically got 4 offers in a couple of weeks, and I had it landed on one, and it closed a couple of weeks after that.
Wow. Well, can you do me a favor and just walk someone through what that looks like? If they're in that area right now and you're thinking about possibly selling, what's some really good advice that you'd give them?
Yeah. So, I mean, just in terms of valuing the company, there was different things that, they generally would want to consider. And I went through this when I was buying out my business partner as well, is that you'll basically look at a multiple of the business. So you would take a look at the profitability over a span of a couple of years, maybe 2 to 3 years, and determine what that multiple is. So for us, our multiple was lower because we were event to event based. Like if you have long-term contracts or like government contracts where that you've got a commitment of X amount of dollars coming in or a period of time or something like that, then your multiple could be a lot higher. And then as the business is in business longer, then obviously like that multiple can also go higher and things like that. But I think our multiple was like 3 or 4 or something like that. So that was essentially how they determined the value of it. So I had some of that information like from going through that process with the mergers and acquisitions company. So I think that's a good place to start, just to get a sense of what the company is actually worth. Obviously COVID had a big impact on our bottom line. So that's kind of like a bit of an anomaly where I think I probably could have negotiated maybe a little bit higher because it was an earnout. But at that point in time, I just, I wanted to obviously walk away with something, but I knew it wouldn't maybe necessarily be as high as what it was prior to COVID.
Right.
That being said, we came out of COVID with a little more money than we had going into it, just because I was really smart about cutting our expenses, taking advantage of subsidies and bursaries and grants and stuff like that. So I kind of look at that as a wash. But the one route is going that mergers and acquisitions route. Otherwise, you could probably hire them as a consultant just to come up with that value. And if you feel confident to approach different companies to try to sell it, then a lawyer could probably transact on the paperwork and things like that.
And do you feel like it is easier to was it easier to reinvent yourself after that business, since you've already done it? Or
so yes and no. I think I didn't really want to be working that hard after I sold the business, coming out of it, because, I felt like I'd worked really hard for 18 years. And for the first time, I was like, I didn't have the pressures of client deadlines and things like that. So I wanted to just take some time with my family and, still kind of got things rolling because I did get my real estate license, but I didn't want to be, at every night, out in open houses every weekend and stuff like that. A couple of the things that I would say have been challenging is that when you're starting over, like I was surprised by the way that people perceive you. Like they almost act like, oh, well, you're new to this. Like, well, I'm not coming out of high school. Like, I've had a business for 20 years, but if you don't have a relationship with someone, they may still be like, oh, well, you haven't sold like 100 houses or something. And it's like, I feel very confident in my ability to sell the work and how to do the work. But I think, there's a lot of, again, competition in that industry. So that's one side of it. And our business was very B2B driven. So we're used to working with corporate clients, business budgets, things like that. And residential real estate can be very emotionally charged. So I think I was surprised at the lack of professionalism in dealing with some clients.
Yeah.
And just, I can understand it's a big decision. It's a big purchase or a big sale or something like that. But I think I was just very surprised by the communication with some clients. So I think my takeaway from that was just to try to pre-qualify people better, to make sure that I'm working with someone that sees value in what I bring to the table. Because maybe I can't say I've sold 100 houses, but I've also done a lot of real estate investing, and I can look at things from a different perspective than maybe the average residential realtor that doesn't even own their own home, let alone have investing experience. So I think you just have to try to focus on differentiating yourself in those different ways. But I'm still kind of getting the lay of the land since I'm just kind of started focusing on it more recently.
And it sounds relatively the same in terms of differentiating yourself, like
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that you've been able to carve that out, to show people that you are this brand.
Yeah.
How easy is it to create your own voice? Like when you're thinking about it, like I need to differentiate myself in the market, like what should you look at first?
Well, I mean, some things are different. Like when I had Tigress, it was, we were always presenting the events and our staff and our clients, like they were the business. That was our credentials. Like I don't think like my picture was in our sales deck. Like, yes, I ran the business, but it was very much about everybody else. And I feel like when you're in real estate, it's like you're on the for sale sign, like they want to work with you. They want to see behind the scenes with you. And it's like, I've found that to be difficult in some ways because I don't want to be that parent that's just like putting my daughter out there publicly on social media. Like the pictures, I do post averts from the back, like you can't see her face. I do have my personal Instagram that's more for like closer family and friends and stuff like that. But I feel like I've always had that, disconnect between the two. But I know with at least this side of real estate, like eventually if I segue into commercial, that would be a little bit different. But on the residential side, it's very much about the personal connections, the personal relationships. People want to know who you are, sometimes even more so than like what your skill level is, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's a very different dynamic in that way.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Putting yourself out and putting your family out is definitely a hard decision, especially when that's not where you're comfortable, Yeah,
and some people do it. I mean, they're all about it, but I mean, that's fine for some people, but I think I just try to be careful of that. Like, like a young, beautiful girl, I don't feel like I want to be putting that out there,
I agree with you. I definitely agree with you. And what are some of the challenges that you find outside of putting yourself out there in the current market today?
Well, the current market today. Yeah. I mean, so it's kind of ironic because when I, was at the point where my daughter she started out in daycare part-time for a year and then went full-time. And at the point where we just put her in, it was like kind of perfect because the market was like at its peak. Things were selling very quickly. It was kind of the perfect time to enter. But then at the same time, I found it very difficult because she was only in daycare 3 days a week. So you're kind of doing that starting and stopping. And, I thought people were really exaggerating when they talk about like daycare germs and getting sick. I hadn't been sick in a few years because of like the pandemic. And then we were so sick. So it felt like every time I was ready to get things going, we were sick again. And it was during a time when it was still very sensitive. Like we were still doing showings with masks on. So I couldn't show up like congested, like it was very tough. And it was like, I'm going to say like a good year to year and a half of that. And it made it very, very hard to really be working consistently. Like I still had my marketing in full swing and stuff like that, but it made it hard in terms of actually like shadowing other realtors or doing certain things or offering to do open houses because it's like, well, I could be sick next week, like it was no joke. Like, I feel like it was just a revolving door constantly. Right. So I think that presented some challenges, and then the interest rates started going up. So everything kind of slowed down, and then we're still kind of in that ebb and flow where things are heating up a little bit, but it's still, a lot of sellers have that expectation from a couple of years ago still, and that's fighting with the reality of the current market and what people are willing to pay and stuff like that. So I would say it definitely presents some challenges.
And I know you have a podcast as well, right?
Yeah, that's right.
On your podcast, it's primarily about investing. And so how do you find that the podcast is helping you to navigate this market?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it really helps to like navigate the market, but I do interview a lot of people from Canada and across the United States. So initially, I started going on podcasts, I think at the end of 2021 or something like that, because I had a book that I published called The Accidental Entrepreneur. And I thought, what better way to promote it than to get in front of other people's audiences? And then I think I was about 6 months, 8 months into that. And one of the girls who was assisting on a podcast I recorded said, you should really have your own podcast. And I was like, that wasn't really something that I wanted to take on. And then I just had the idea for it. So it's called Inspire to Invest. And I am part of a couple of robust real estate investing communities. And I thought, it'd be nice to tell the stories of people, like where they were, what the catalyst was to investing, how they got to where they are, like all the challenges and stories and successes and stuff that kind of come along with that. But I think it's just such an important topic right now, because as we've seen with inflation, like you can't just count on your paycheck necessarily anymore. And, $100,000 today is not what it was a couple of years ago. Right. And I think that if you're not strategic in investing and creating that long-term wealth, I think just getting by is going to be increasingly challenging for people. I think retiring comfortably is going to be very difficult. And I think it's something that should be almost like a necessity for most people. Like even when I look at my family, like there's some people that almost treated like their house is like an ATM. They would spend all this money and then they keep refinancing, and then their mortgages are like triple today than they were 15 years ago. And now they're finding it very hard to keep up, very limited retirement savings, and never really thought about doing a whole lot of investing. And I think it's going to be a very scary reality for a lot of people. Just, I never thought about food prices. And now in the last year, I'm just like, what?
I know.
And they're not small increases. It's not like a 20-cent increase. It's like, this was $5, now it's $9. Like they are very, very significant increases, right? So I think for the average person, the average family, I think it's going to be a more important now than ever. And, even for our daughter, like we started her education funding like a few years ago. And as that starts to grow, like I want to move that over into some other options that will bring her that like nest egg kind of starting out when she's an adult.
Right. And, it's really an important conversation to have, right? And I think a lot of entrepreneurs too get caught up in running their business and as you were saying before, keeping that money aside and not realizing that they need to use that to actually help, because what things are today and the prices people are willing to pay, they don't relate. So
you're just sitting in the bank, you're actually losing money. Like when you really think about the pace of inflation, like it will technically be like worth less down the road, right? So I think you still have to be very smart with how you're investing and do appropriate due diligence and stuff like that. But I think you've got to do something with it.
Mm-hmm. And it's crazy, right? So you're working all these hours, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're working 9 to 5, but there's only so much that you're taking home, right? And then the prices are ridiculous on the opposite end. So I think your mentor really helped you when they said, hey, listen, you should really invest.
Yeah. No, I agree.
And I mean, any other advice that you'd give a starting entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, when you're just starting out, obviously, like you're probably just trying to even pay yourself, like let alone, investing is kind of something you're going to think about down the road. But for me, the couple things that I wish I'd done sooner, like having mentorship earlier on, I think would have been very helpful. Right. And for us, like SEO earlier on, like we started in 2004 and we met with someone in 2005 that's like, I want to talk to you about SEO. And like, we didn't even have a website. And if I could go back to that moment, like I would have like taken money off my line of credit and just paid to get that done, because it would have really accelerated our growth tremendously. Like we would have been 8 years ahead of where we were. And, we didn't really start doing SEO until we lost our biggest client. And at the time they represented maybe 60 to 70% of our business. And it was kind of in a position where I was like, if we don't start bringing in more opportunities, like we're going to be out of business. So we started doing that. And we went from, I think, one call from like net new clients every few weeks to like, we started getting 3 calls a day, like overnight. And yes, our closing ratio may not be what it was in the beginning. Like when it's a warm referral, like maybe we're closing 80 to 90%. So maybe we were closing 50 to 60%, but that's on like a couple hundred leads instead of like 50, So obviously every year we're incrementally growing based on the exposure and the opportunities and things like that. So I think you just have to put yourself in a position where you can be found. And for us, like it was a very niche type of business. So people would be searching like, Calgary brand ambassadors or Toronto event staffing. And, they could be from another city or another country, but they're coming here for a trade show, or they're trying to promote a product that they're launching. So that's how people would essentially find us, and, totally transformed our whole business. So if I had done that sooner, like truly understanding the value a lot sooner, like, I'm sure our trajectory could have been a lot different.
And how are you using that in your business now that you have the know-how?
Yeah. So, I mean, things continue to change. Like, I think that's one thing is like my training and the stuff I did back in 2012 and 13 is not necessarily what it is now. And again, I think the challenge is that it is very competitive. So for me, walking in when there's, I think, 80,000 licensed realtors in Ontario, like the average, like my coach even said, she's like, the realtors are just hanging from trees. Like, it's like, yes, people could be Google searching, but I joined an agent accelerator program where people could be on Zoocasa or Zillow and they're just checking out a property and then they put in an inquiry. So then we have internal sales agents that would introduce them to me if it's in my area. And then I would either take them out or explain things or whatever that is. So it's digital marketing in a different way. And then obviously with social media, like I think having the podcast has really helped drive my audience there. Like I think I've probably grown by about 6,000 or 7,000 followers since I launched it. And I think just because you are presenting that value, you're sharing other people's stories so that they're sharing their own stories. It's kind of like the quote, we rise by lifting others. So by featuring everybody else, it kind of like brings people back to you and stuff like that. So I think it's still early. Like I think I'm only on episode 48 this week. So compared to people are in the hundreds and stuff like that. Right. But it is a way I think that you can show, what you're talking about, and you can kind of build that relationship with people before you have the chance to meet face to face. And then beyond that, I'm trying to find ways that I can connect more in my community, because I've lived in the same place for 30 years, but I don't actually know very many people. So, even with my daughter starting junior kindergarten this year, like I can connect with other parents and stuff like that. So I think, in the long run, it'll be good. It's just obviously I'm starting a new chapter. So. Yeah.
And I really love like your story, like the conversation we had before, talking about just the transition and what that looked like. I'm always inspired by people that can reinvent themselves, and for me, I know I've had to do it several times. And, as entrepreneurs, what you start out in is not necessarily what you're going to end up in.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, I never would have thought that there would come a time when I would leave. Like, I feel like, I felt like I kind of grew it to this certain point when I think back to the business, and even the office that we had, even though it was a leased space, like how we transformed it and what we turned it into, like, I just was so heartbroken to walk away from that. It just didn't make sense to keep it when we didn't have the money coming in to support it. And again, I didn't think I had it in me to literally rebuild it to what it was. And I didn't want to necessarily work at that pace anymore. Like have a family, like changes your priorities and, forces you to slow down. And, there was a period of time where I think what solidified it for me, I think it was like the 4 or 5 months leading up to that employee quitting. We had some work going on and we're at the cottage, and of course, like everyone's booking stuff on short notice and stuff. So this client that we quoted on stuff booked a pretty big influencer event on like 3 weeks. And I was sitting inside at the cottage, just like buried in work. And my daughter's like outside playing with my husband. I was like, oh, I hate this. Like, this is not what I want to be doing like on a weekend right now, because a client took so long just to confirm it. Like if she confirmed it like 6 weeks in advance rather than 3, like it wouldn't have been like such a crunch. Right. And I think just clients were it was bad before the pandemic, but it was almost like getting notoriously worse after. And I just had to take a step back and reflect, like, is this really what I want? Like, I've spent half my life building this company, but is it what I really want now? And I think I just had to take a look at like what those priorities were like and what I wanted in my life. And again, I had a lot of passive income as well, so I didn't necessarily need it. So I just decided it was time.
And I like that. You took the time to actually reflect on, is it what you want? And I know a lot of entrepreneurs go through it, they have a business, they built the business and they're overwhelmed by the business, but they just don't want to leave because either the feeling of obligation or just the fear of losing the business. Like, what are you going to do now? And, you're known as something, moving on to something else is like really scary.
Yeah.
How
Yeah. I
did
think
you?
the unknown is scary, but it's not like I just sold it and didn't have anything else
No,
going on.
absolutely.
Like obviously
Yeah.
I had lots of investments. I had my real estate license. Like I had some other things I had worked on as a backup plan and stuff like that. Right. But I
Right.
think, it can be hard when you work so hard on something. Like you're very attached to that with your identity. And like there's a lot of things that was nice to have with having your own business and just having a team to delegate things to and like kind of building yourself up to that point. Like I can see why people would be very attached to that. But I think it's important just not to let yourself get swept away in that if it's really not suitable to your life anymore.
I have a question for you. After you made the transition, did you have like friends or family saying, "Hey, but I know you as this," like, and now you're telling them, "Hey, listen, this is what I'm doing now." Do you find that they're equally as supportive, or do you feel like they're like questioning it?
I don't think anyone in my direct network ever questioned it. Like, I mean, I think because it was such a transition, you know what I mean? Like the whole world was in transition. Like with
True.
COVID, everything came to this pause. And, I was kind of like started to I got my marketing kind of going right after I got my license, even though I knew I wasn't going to actually start working for a while. So it was kind of like this gradual shift. Like that was probably 8 months before I sold the company. So I've already been putting those things out there and stuff like that. So I don't think it really would come as a complete surprise to anybody, but it is kind of what it is.
And I like that you said that, right? So that is a good tip, right? So if you plan on switching or transitioning, to actually put it out there, so people get warm up to the idea.
Yeah. Well, I was just trying to build a foundation, right? So if anything, it was like when I put it out there, I was almost like overwhelmed because there was a couple of people that reached out and they're like, "Hey, can you help with this or help with that?" And I was like, because I had started to put it out there, I was like, "Wait, I'm not ready." Like there was a combination of things happening. Like my daughter was only, I think, a year and a half. My mother-in-law was sick with terminal cancer, and we were juggling a lot of things, right? So yes, I was doing that, but it was kind of funny because it was like right away a couple of people reached out. I was like, no, not really. So I kind of pushed. I kind of regret maybe not taking some of those things looking back on it, but again, I just had to prioritize family at that point in time.
And that's good too, right? To know that here's the thing. This is where I am. This is where I want to be, but I'm not really ready right now.
Yeah.
And that's okay too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
And I really, really love the fact that you're able to know who you are, which I think is really important. And also a really important message for people. Like you have to know who you are, how you're feeling, and actually listen to that.
Yeah.
And was that something that you learned from someone else, or you just know yourself?
I think I've always been the kind of person that always had to provide for myself to some extent, just because my family was very complicated. Like my parents split when I was just 4 years old, and my brother passed away shortly after, and then I spent time living with my mom and then my dad and then an aunt and uncle, and moved around a lot. But when it came down to it, and school was kind of nearing its end, I put myself through university, got a scholarship to cover a little bit more than half the cost. I was always out working like 3 and 4 different jobs and stuff like that. Just said yes to everything. And I think I knew, yes, I had a roof over my head or like food in the fridge, but it's like at the end of the day, I still had to provide a lot for myself, like maybe more than the average person. So I think I was always just used to kind of like those survival instincts, just like you got to do what you got to do and you got to have money coming in and stuff like that. So I think my natural instinct would be to go at that breakneck speed. But I think now at the age that I'm at, and again, just going back to having my daughter and stuff, it's just not realistic to think that you can be a fabulous parent and then be out doing all that stuff as well necessarily. Like I know there may be some people that do. I don't know if they have nannies or like maybe they don't see their kids a lot, but I just didn't want to be like that. I wanted to be a present parent with her, and we've done a lot of traveling with her already and stuff like that. So I think it's just trying to understand again what is most important for you, because she's only going to be young once. We only have her. We don't have any intention to have any other kids. So I just really wanted to protect that time as much as possible. Like I still have probably a good 20 years ahead of me if I want to be working. So I can do that when she's a little bit older, but she's only going to be young once.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can relate. I remember going really, really hard at this business that we had. And, at the end of the business, when it closed during COVID, like we had spoken about before, my kids were like older. And I
Yeah.
woke up and I'm like, I missed all that time, serving others. So,
Yeah.
at this point now, it's just really knowing this is what I want to do. And if it doesn't align with that, then it just doesn't align and I just can't do it. And I
Yeah.
think it's so
Yeah.
important for people to understand that, the time outside that you're dedicating to something doesn't stop,
Yeah. Yeah.
and one day you wake up and you're like, wow, all those
Yeah.
years are gone.
Yeah. And I mean, I think nowadays it's a little easier with technology and stuff like that, just the way that, even with COVID and the shift to remote working, even though, some people maybe are going back to the office now and stuff like that, but I think it's far more acceptable now than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Right. So I think it's really shifted the dynamic and just open up opportunities for people. Right. So I think if you can take advantage of that, then so be it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And how are you using the digital landscape right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI is definitely one thing that's been helpful because I went from a team where I used to be able to delegate a lot of stuff, and then now I'm doing a lot of things on my own. So I definitely take advantage of, things like ChatGPT and even just to write my social media posts and stuff like that, right? Like I'll plan out my calendar for at least a week in advance and I'll kind of design certain aspects to it, but then I can be like, write a post on this to go with the video that I have. And it's like, that's done in 30 seconds as opposed to like half an hour of me like writing something. And I think you just have to find ways to be as efficient as possible. And I think that, I just try to batch a lot of the stuff that I do. Like I'll get all my blogs done and posted and scheduled like a month in advance.
Wow.
Instead of just natively posting a schedule, like a lot of different posts, take advantage of just different AI tools that you can, even just like there was an editor, like with Opus Clip, for example, it'll chop up your episodes into smaller bite-sized chunks and stuff like that. So you're not sitting there like trying to get them edited or paying someone to edit them and stuff like that. So I think, when now I've gone from having a business and a corporation to like a solopreneur, right? So I think you just have to be really smart with your time. And even when I record my podcast, like I batch record, so I'll do 2 half days of recording, usually every few months, but I have episodes recorded like months in advance. So then the production is just kind of like a little bit month to month, but it makes it far easier than just like doing ad hoc as really hard to focus, right? So
Right. And then that goes back to the systems, right? Because the systems that you learned, you're bringing it over into this. Love it. Love it. So is there anything that you would love to share with our guests? Anything that you feel would help them, inspire them?
Yeah, I mean, I know we just briefly talked about my book, but I think that's definitely one thing that, it felt like something I was really compelled to do. And again, going back to my childhood, I had a lot of challenges and stuff like that growing up, but I feel like it really paved my path into entrepreneurship and saying yes to those opportunities and stuff like that. So I think it's something that really resonates to people that have gone through personal challenges. Like even when I was promoting it in advance of it coming out, there's a lot of people that wanted to read it because they had lost a loved one or they'd gone through a divorce or they're a child of divorce. And then it kind of leads into a lot of the business stuff and all those lessons. So I think it, kind of straddles 2 sides because it's got the memoir side and the personal stories, but then it also has all the business tips and the entrepreneurial challenges and successes and stuff like that as well. So I think for someone that, feels like they can take some of those things away, then it could be a good read for them.
I love it. And obviously I'm going to share the links with everybody where they can find it, but can you also share where can they find you?
Yeah, for sure. So I have a few different things going on, but, for my podcast, it's at Inspired to Invest podcast. My real estate stuff is under Serena Holmes Realtor. I do have very robust link trees with links to like episodes, my book, like intakes and all of that stuff. But that's probably the easiest two platforms to find me.
Okay. And if someone needed something really quick, and they opened your book and was like, you know what, I really need help in the area of my business, what chapters do you think would be the best ones for them to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of chapters, obviously. I think there's one where I talk about passive income opportunities. So I think that's definitely one that's really helpful. There's some stuff in regards to, I think one chapter is called 2 weeks notice, and it talks about employee management and things like that. But again, they're all different. Like a lot of it, you don't maybe think of adding something to your business until something happens. So it has a lot of those lessons and challenges that you kind of learn along the way. Like I never would have dreamed I would need a lawyer as many times as I did having a business, right? Like we had a service called prepaid legal that we paid $50 a month for, and we're like, we'll get it. When will we ever need it? And like, my gosh, I probably use that lawyer like 20 different times for like things that you never would even dream would come up, right? So I think just when you're in business, like anything can happen.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on, and you have to get the book. I'll put the link there for you to be able to get it at the end of the show. And thank you again, Serena, for being our guest.
Thank you.
Thank you.